What was supposed to be a peaceful 2 week hike through the Great Smoky Mountains quickly turned into a living nightmare for two brothers. But before we get into their encounter, welcome back to Dark Wilderness, where I share encounters with the unexplained. If you've had an encounter that you would like to share, please email me at the link below. And if you like today's story, please gently slap that like button, as I'll be uploading multiple times every week. So before you hit the Appalachian Trail, make sure you keep that subscribe button close in your pack so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. This encounter comes from Brady and it happened in 2006 when him and his brother Jay were hiking the Great Smoky Mountains portion of the Appalachian Trail. This portion of the Appalachian Trail that runs through the Smoky Mountains runs for about 71 kilometers, and it basically follows the border of North Carolina and Tennessee. It starts down at the southwestern side of the park at a place called Fontana Dam, and it runs northeast up until it gets to a place called Davenport Gap. There's one halfway point along this trail, which is called Newfound Gap, and that's the only part of this trail where there's actually a highway that intersects through it. This area is absolutely remote and rugged wilderness, just full of mountains, dense forest, lots of steep valleys. This part of the trail too, it takes about 7 days to hike. There's multiple rest stops along the way with 12 different shelters set up along the trail. This is a very popular portion of the Appalachian Trail, and the route could actually be shortened to 3 days if you start at one of the trailheads and make your way to the center point, which is at Newfound Gap, or start at Newfound Gap and make your way to one of the trailheads. And in June of 2006, Brady, who was 25, his younger brother Jay was 23, and Jay had just gone through a really rough breakup. So Brady kind of wanted to get his brother back into good spirits, so he proposed that they take a couple of weeks off work and they go hike through the Smokies. His plan was to start at the southwestern side at Fontana Dam, go all the way to the northeast side at Davenport Gap, hitch a ride into a town, kind of restock on supplies, hitch another ride back to the northeast trailhead, and then make their way all the way back southwest to Fontana Dam where their vehicle would be. Jay thought that was a great idea. He figured that would get his mind off of everything he was kind of going through. So both of them put their requests for time off into work, and they spent the next couple of weeks kind of preparing for this trip. They were very avid outdoorsmen. They were into hunting and fishing, but they soon found out that they did not have the proper gear for a hike of this length. So they kind of had to go to a bunch of different outdoor shops, pick up new gear, and then they spent a couple of weeks just kind of breaking in their new boots. On the first day of their trip, they loaded up into Brady's truck and they made the drive over to Fontana Dam. Once they got there, they gathered all their gear out of the truck, locked it up, and then they started making their way down the trail. The first day went great. They were making really good time going down the trail. And Jay noticed that this was actually really helping him. It was really helping take his mind off of everything going on back at home. And before they knew it, they were at one of those shelters. They took a look at their watch and they realized it was about 2 hours before dark. At that point, they decided, you know what, we might as well just set up camp here and we'll carry on in the morning. So they set their makeshift camp up at the shelter. They got a fire going, had some food. And shortly before dark, another group of hikers arrived at that shelter. It was a group of 6 guys, and they asked if they would not mind them joining them for the night. Now, hiking etiquette on trails like this is that those shelters are for anybody to use, and you cannot really deny another group or another hiker from using those shelters. Jay was a little upset with this at first, but he figured, you know what, I have 2 weeks out here with my brother. This won't be a problem. I have lots of time. Unfortunately, though, this other group that was at the shelter with them, they were not carrying on down the trail. They basically just hiked to this specific shelter as more or less just a drinking escape. So all night, this other group was fairly rowdy, and it was really disturbing Brady and Jay. So the next morning when they woke up and they started going back down the trail, they decided that from this point on, for the rest of their trip, they were not going to stay at the shelters. They were actually going to go off trail a little ways, kind of just avoid people, be off on their own, so they would not have to deal with a situation like that again. A couple of hours into the second day, Jay started to have the feeling like they were being followed and that they were being watched. He brought it up to Brady, and Brady too, he had the exact same feeling, but both of them kind of chalked it off to, you know what, it's more than likely just that other group. They've probably decided to go further down the trail than they originally said, so they kind of tried to brush it off. However, throughout the day, that feeling, especially for Jay, got stronger and stronger, and as they were making their way down the trail, periodically they would see figures darting in between trees, and they would catch a quick glimpse of what looked like somebody peeking from behind a tree and then quickly dodging in behind it again. This made both of them feel pretty on edge, so they made sure as they made their way down the trail that they just stayed in constant communication with each other. They just kept asking each other, "Do you hear anything? Do you see anything?" Or even if they felt anything. And sure enough, though, periodically throughout the day, they would catch glimpses of those figures darting in between the trees. About an hour before dark, they came up to another one of those shelters. There were no other hikers there. So they just carried on past this shelter for about a half an hour. A half hour before dark, they stopped on the trail and they just stood there for about 15 minutes, just kind of looking into the woods and listening, just to try to make sure that they were still not being followed. Once they were pretty confident that they were not being followed anymore, they turned off the trail and they made their way about a quarter of a mile into the woods. They found a nice flat spot with some mud so that they were able to build a fire to heat their food. They did not want to build a big fire. They did not want to alert those people that were following them where exactly they were. Once they had their fire going, they proceeded to set up their camp. They also, aside from setting up their tent, they also set up a tarp in between two trees and ran it down to a bucket. The purpose for that was to catch any type of rainwater that might fall through the night, or even the dew in the morning, just to kind of act as a secondary source of drinking water for them. Once they had their camp set up, they sat down by the fire, they had some food, and at about 11 o'clock, they went into the tent to call it a night. At about 1:30 in the morning, Brady woke up because he could hear something moving around outside the tent. So he kind of lied there in his sleeping bag, looking up at the roof of the tent, just listening to what was happening outside the tent. And he heard what sounded like somebody tiptoeing around their campsite. He could hear the sound move from the one side of the tent around to the front, in between the tent to the fire, and then disappear off into the woods on the other side of the tent. He lied there just staring at the top of the tent, listening for about another half an hour just to see if that sound would come back. After he noticed that that sound did not come back, he started to kind of rationalize, this was most likely just a raccoon. It could have been a fox. It didn't sound very big. If it would have been one of these people, they would have made a lot more noise. I would have heard them coming from a distance because of how thick the woods are. So it kind of put him at ease and he was able to fall back. When they woke up in the morning, they got out of the tent. Jay proceeded to start to make a fire and Brady went over to the water trap. Once he got to where they had set it up, their tarp and their bucket were gone. So he called over to Jay. Jay came over and now the two of them are kind of standing there staring at this blank space in between these two trees, trying to figure out what happened to their tarp and what happened to their bucket. Jay said to Brady, "I wonder if it was whoever we were seeing yesterday." Brady said, "I can't see somebody who was following us taking only the tarp and only the bucket. If they were going through the trouble of following us all day yesterday and finding our camp in the pitch black, they would have most likely probably mugged us or taken something of value and not just the tarp and not just the bucket." So he was kind of trying to rationalize what happened to this tarp. And what he came up with was, chances are maybe we had some food grease on our fingers, maybe something spilt in our pack. The tarp smelled like food and a bear or another wild animal came and just kind of dragged it off into the bush. Both of them kind of, even though they felt that that was a little far-fetched as well, they both settled on that being the reason why these two items were missing, and they just kind of carried on with the rest of the morning. After they had some food, they packed up their tent and they carried on down the trail. That day, they did not see any more of those figures darting in between trees. They did not have the feeling that they were being followed, and they just started to feel really good about the hike again. By the end of that day, they were at Newport Gap, which is the halfway mark of that portion of the trail. So they kind of started talking to each other. They decided, they're just going to carry on with the hike like they had planned. The night before, they had actually talked about potentially ending their hike at Newport Gap. But because that day went so well, they did not have the feelings of being watched. They did not have the feelings of being followed. And they didn't see any figures darting in between trees. They figured, we're just being ridiculous. We're going to be fine. That was just a one-time occurrence. So they decided they would just carry on down the trail. And that night, they actually camped pretty close to Newport Gap. They had nothing weird happen to them that night. So the next morning, they got up and they started making their way down the trail again. Same thing as the day before. All day, they just did not have those feelings, did not see any figures darting in between trees. And they were really starting to unwind at this point and just, again, start to enjoy the hike, starting to enjoy taking in the scenery. And that night, instead of waiting till a half hour before dark to venture off the trail, they decided, there's nobody following us. Let's venture off the trail about 2 hours before dark. It'll give us lots of time to set up camp. We'll be setting up in the daylight this time, not in the dark. And we'll be able to enjoy ourselves a little bit more. So 2 hours before dark, they turned off the trail, made their way about a quarter mile into the bush, set up camp, got a fire going. They spent the evening basically just unwinding and relaxing after a long day of hiking. They were feeling a lot less on edge, a lot more easygoing. So they had a lot bigger of a fire going that night than they had the last couple of nights. But same thing, at about 11 o'clock, they made their way into the tent and they called it a night and went to bed. At about 12:30 in the morning, Jay was awoken by the sound of something rubbing up against the side of the tent. It jolted him awake and he quickly turned his head and he was staring at the tent fabric, kind of trying to figure out what that noise was that he just heard. He lay there for a few seconds, not hearing anything, but then he heard what sounded again like somebody tiptoeing through their campsite. Now, that was the same sound that Brady had heard that second night, but Brady actually did not tell Jay about that sound. So Jay's lying there listening to whatever's outside the tent sound like it's tiptoeing through the campsite, and he decides he's going to wake his brother up. So he reaches over, wakes up Brady, tells him that he hears what sounds like somebody tiptoeing through the campsite. Brady is instantly alerted, looks at Joe and tells him that he heard that sound that second night. So now both of them are inside the tent, really on edge. So Brady grabs his flashlight and he starts shining it out the front of the tent. He starts moving his light from left to right, and all of a sudden, directly in front of the tent, off to the right, right at the bush line, he sees this woman staring right back at him. Only this woman was very malnourished and incredibly filthy. She was completely covered in mud and dirt. She was wearing what looked like an old blanket kind of just wrapped around her body and tied with what looked like a rope. And her hair was completely caked with mud. It looked like she had sticks and leaves sticking out of her hair as well. And she just stared right back at him. A couple of seconds later, she lets out a scream, she turns, and she runs into the trees. His first thought was that this was another hiker or it was somebody that was lost, and he felt the need to go help this woman. So he told his brother what he had just saw, and both of them quickly scrambled out of the tent and went running into the woods after this woman. When they got into the woods, they started calling out to her to see if she needed help, but they got no response back. So they moved just a little bit deeper into the woods, about another 20 yards, stopped, and started calling out again. They called a few times and then they just kind of went silent, just trying to see if they could hear any sound of her at all moving through the bush. Shortly after, all of a sudden they heard that woman start to scream, and it sounded like she was screaming some type of weird language that they did not understand. It was definitely not English, but it was definitely some form of a language. Right after she was yelling in that other language, they heard multiple other male voices and another female voice responding back in the same type of sounding language, coming from various different parts inside the woods around them. Brady ended up yelling to Joe to get back to camp, so the two of them ran back to the tent, and as soon as they got there, Brady started gathering up any wood he could find, and he just threw it all on top of the fire, trying to make the flames big enough so that they could kind of see the area around them. And as the flames did grow, they started to notice more and more of these individuals staring back into their camp. Each and every one of them that they saw looked just like that woman, completely covered in dirt, covered in mud, very unkept clothing, mud caked in their hair. And these people just stood there, just staring at them while they were standing by the fire. Brady and Jay at this point are not sure if those people are going to attack them or not, so they decided they were going to arm themselves. Jay grabbed his hatchet, Brady grabbed his survival knife, and he also grabbed a couple of bear bangers. What a bear banger is it's essentially a pen that launches a projectile that'll explode after about 100 feet, and it mimics the sound of a 12-gauge shotgun. It's used to scare off bears and other wildlife. And at this point, Brady decided he was going to take a chance and he was going to fire one of these bear bangers towards these people to see if maybe it would scare them off. So he picked up his bear banger, aimed it towards them, fired, and as soon as it ignited and went off, the people scattered and just went running into the bush. So they both kind of breathed a temporary sigh of relief because that immediate danger was gone because those people had run further into the woods. However, they could still hear them screaming and shouting to each other in that language. And periodically over the next few hours, those people would start making their way back towards their camp. And every time that they would get to the edge of the bush line and they were illuminated by the fire, Brady would fire another bear banger towards them and they would go scattering off again. At one point, shortly before dawn, Brady had actually run out of bear bangers, and those people were making their way back towards their camp. At this point, Jay was actually tempted to actually light the forest on fire to kind of create a bit of a firewall between them and these people. The only thing that really held him back on that was the fact that he did not know who else was in the area and he did not want to put anybody else's life in danger. So at this point, he just held up his hatchet, Brady held up his knife, and the two of them got ready for a fight just in case these people did attack. However, after about 45 minutes of a complete standstill of these people just staring at them and both of them just kind of getting ready for a fight, the sun started to come up and those people slowly started backing away into the forest, and shortly after, they could no longer see them. Brady and Jay at this point, they ran back for the main trail. Once they were on the trail, they just ran south, and they ran south all day till they got to Newfound Gap. Once they got to the highway at Newfound Gap, they got in contact with the Rangers. The Rangers came, they explained to them exactly what happened, and the Ranger that they were talking to actually ended up giving them a ride all the way back to their vehicle. The Ranger said that they would go check out where they had the camp set up, and they would let them know if they found anything. Brady and Jay ended up going home, and a few days later, the Ranger actually called them back and said that they found where they had the camp set up because they found remnants of the fire, but everything that they had left behind was absolutely gone, and they could not find any sign of those people. Brady ended up taking to the internet. He went to Facebook, different forums, different groups, trying to figure out who these people were and if anybody else had ever come across anybody like this before. And he came across several reports of feral people that live in national parks, different forests, all across the country and all across the continent. And his advice is, if you're going on a hike like this, if you're in a national park and you're going along one of these long trails, he said always camp at the shelters. Don't make your way off the trail. Always go in a larger group. He said he does not know what these people wanted, but he just wants people to be safe, go in larger groups, and just kind of stick to the trails. Well, that's it for today's encounter. As always, thanks for joining us, and if you have any comments, please leave it in the comments below. And if you haven't done so already, before you hit the Appalachian Trail, keep that subscribe button close in your pack, and I'll see you next time.